You are listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to C-Suite Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series. And in today's discussion, we're going to talk about CEO and executive compensation practices. Specifically, how do boards determine CEO pay and what's on the horizon that might change all that? Joining me today is Dana Etra, the Managing Director and Head of the Boston office of F.W. Cook, a very prominent compensation consultant to boards of directors. Dana, welcome.
Thank you, Steve. I'm glad to be here.
Well, thank you. Well, Dana, you've been doing this for a long time. You're a supreme expert in executive compensation. You advise companies and boards of directors. I can't think of a better person to answer and clear up some of these issues around CEO pay. You know, the part of the problem is in the press today, you know, executive compensation, CEO pay is all positioned as being out of control, hugely, you know, multiples of, you know, whatever everybody else is paid. They're overpaid, they're underworked. You know, what's your take on all of this?
I tend to take what hits the press with a grain of salt. There was a favorite headline of mine from the EpiPen pricing scandal where somebody said, it was a major news source that said, Mylan's CEO increases her own pay by 600%, while EpiPen prices increased by 300%, something to that effect. And I remember thinking, could that be true? And looking back at public disclosures and realizing that the pay increase they referenced included during promotion to CEO. So that is a backdrop, just an anecdote for why I tend to take it with a grain of salt, because a lot of the times the folks who are talking about compensation aren't as deep in the weeds as a practitioner like me, and we think about pay in a very different way.
Yeah, and you know, part of the problem though is that their information comes largely from the proxy, which is the annual document that is issued every year by public companies, required by law. And these tables, wow, they have gotten to be so complicated, and they add up, you know, base pay, they add up, you know, the some sort of modeling, Black-Scholes modeling on the value of options and all that, and they've come up with this ginormous number of pay, but that's not actually what necessarily goes to, you know, in the paycheck of an executive.
You're exactly right. It's those huge numbers that you see disclosed at these big companies describe, as relates to stock, the grant date opportunity. And for a share of stock, either with performance conditions or without, that's the value at the time of grant. And if there are performance conditions, that may never be earned.
Yeah. And it says if everything goes well and the company does well and the company and the stock grows at this rate, then maybe they can get this back. But then there are also, you know, other things, and we're going to come back to this, but just to set the context, I think there's a lot of noise out there and a lot of misconceptions. But part of what, you know, you see this dialing up during periods of time of economic stress where, you know, general pay levels are not keeping up pace with inflation. And I think that was probably the case in 2023. You know, talk about the challenge of setting executive compensation in those periods.
So executive compensation right now, I mean, the market context, as you referenced, is absolutely critical. You know, if you think about 2020 into 2021, the stock market went bananas and the labor market was off the rails. It was a really frothy labor market, as we'll say. People were quitting their job all over the place for 20, 50, 100% increases if they took jobs elsewhere. Companies were absolutely throwing money around, and stock in particular, because as stock prices were high, there was a lot of value to it, and it was really hard to keep folks in their seats when it was a seller's market, as you might say. Now, coming off of that high-flying capital market and the frothy labor market that came with it, many of the broader macroeconomic forces here are impacting the way companies set pay and the dynamics there. So we've seen a reduction in deployed investor capital, right? We saw over 1,000 IPOs in 2021 and somewhere sub 200 in 2022 and 2023. And as companies and investors increase their focus on cost efficiency, they're focusing more on the cash spend and reining in salary increase budgets. We saw lower salary increase budgets this year than we did in the 2 years preceding. And with stock-based compensation expense and dilution being a focus coming out of that, we've seen companies really rein in the way they're spending stock. And that, of course, is compounded by the fact that the stock prices are now depressed for many companies. So it takes many more shares of stock to deliver the same value. So rather than throwing around massive sums of stock to many, if not all, employees to try to keep folks in their seats, companies are having to be really targeted in the payment actions they're taking, in the context of the softened labor market, the continued economic uncertainty, and the stock price declines in certain industries.
Yeah, and you're mentioning stock as an important part of the compensation package, and it is the piece that really kind of inflates the number in the proxy. But if you look at the components of executive pay, it's a base salary, which is typically now, I think, Dana, somewhere around 10% of total compensation. So that's the fixed component. You have variable bonus based on performance in a company, and then the stock, which also is variable, can be zero payout, or it can be a lot if the company performs well, which is what you want. So those are the major three components. You also have, other things, but people have to keep in mind that the fixed component is really relatively tiny, and the rest of it is all dependent on how the company does, and that's at what the shareholders want, because they want compensation tied to pay.
That's right.
And I mean, compensation tied to results. But that has evolved over time, because back in the early 80s, it was largely, cash compensation based on bonus, and there was an advocacy for stock compensation. Talk about that whole evolution of the composition.
Oh, the evolution has actually been a fascinating one. I heard somebody say at a conference I was at 2 weeks ago that the result of trying to regulate compensation is necessarily an increase in the rates of compensation.
What does that mean?
Anytime we try to put rules around things to rein things in, it's the result is a backdoor or a loophole is found. So
it becomes a floor is then, and everybody raises to the floor. Is that
yeah, or we find ways around it, and it gets risk adjusted, so to speak. So there used to be, so in general, for companies, compensation expenses are deductible. And there's a section of the tax code, section 162M, that says for certain covered executives, compensation over $1 million is not deductible. Now, prior to the 2017 tax reform, when this exemption was eliminated, it would say compensation over $1 million is not deductible, which is, of course, an attempt to rein in pay, unless it's performance-based. So what we would do was we'd put performance goals on anything over $1 million. And sometimes that was, if you have $1 in net income, then these stock awards can vest. And that made the compensation deductible. So anytime there's regulation that tries to rein something in or keep it on the straight and narrow, a way is found around it.
Yeah, and it's the unintended consequences. But it has evolved from almost a total compensation based on cash to mostly incentives based on the variability of the performance of the company. Wouldn't you agree?
Very much. If we look at, the value of pay packages having increased dramatically over the past 20, 30, 40 years, the executive level, it's not at the salary level. Salaries have gone up, certainly. And when that $1 million exemption loophole was eliminated, we did see companies getting much more comfortable increasing over $1 million. But as you referenced, base pay tends to make up less than 10% of total comp to CEOs at the largest companies. Yeah. And the rest of it is all company performance based.
Now, CEO pay is not the same in every company. We read in the newspaper about these giant packages. They tend to be the largest companies. But when you think about, the S&P or, the Russell 3000, and you take the whole environment of CEOs into context, I think the average CEO pay comes out to be about $1 million, which, by the way, is great, and they're not missing any meals, but it's not these, humongous things. But over the past 40 years, as you said too, the size of companies have changed with all the mergers, acquisitions, and growth. And so, you have some of these companies that are larger than countries, and hence finding talent to run something that large and complex is really hard for boards, and that's been a partial contributor to it as well.
Absolutely. I think a lot of times the eye-popping number that folks read, it overshadows the absolutely mind-blowing amount of expertise and time and effort and work and headache that is required to do one of these jobs. I mean, if you think about, we think about any picture they've shown of a U.S. president, before election and after election, that very obvious and visual impact of that kind of job for that number of years. I would venture you'd see the same thing with CEOs, though I haven't seen a study on this.
Well, I've seen them in person, and it is the same. I mean, these jobs they do a number, and that's partially what's contributed to a relatively short tenure too. You have to think about, a CEO building, their whole career up to this point, and then they last 5 or 6 years, before either they just can't do it anymore, or it's just time for a change. So that's a relatively short period of time, and hence, part of this as well. Now, you talked about, the variable pay components being, the ones that are the big numbers, but they're also variable, 0 to big. Just talk about the composition of what goes into variable pay.
So there are two main components, and one of them I'll break down after. The first one is an annual bonus, which most of the time is paid in cash and is based on goals set for the year in question. So this is fiscal year 2024. At the beginning of the year, most companies will set goals. We want you to achieve X, Y, and Z this year. Maybe some scaling above and below those targets for downside protection or to reward outperformance, but that's a cash payment at the end of the year, a bonus or an annual incentive. The other major component, and the biggest component that's bigger and bigger as companies get bigger, is a stock-based component, or actually I should say a long-term incentive. Now, this is a lot of times it's stock. There are also companies that use cash for long-term incentives, and there are a few versions of it. It can either be based on specific performance measures, like the bonus I just described, or it can be based on time. So you just have to complete your requisite service to receive that stock.
So it's a retention device, essentially.
For normal shares, what I'll call normal shares of stock, which are restricted shares or restricted stock units, or RSUs, as you might hear me say, it's highly retentive. It's a retention mechanism. It protects you on the downside if the stock price goes down, but if the stock price goes up, you can make much more money. Stock options, however, are worth nothing to the recipient if the stock price doesn't increase. So there's some retentive element in an increasing stock price environment, but it's also tied to the performance of the stock.
Yeah, and this is hard. You mentioned that the articles were XYZ CEO, she paid herself this much. These aren't CEOs determining their pay. These are boards of directors, independent directors only. And, working with you as a compensation consultant, as an outside expertise, there's a lot of care that goes into this. Just describe that process.
So that's a great point. And I didn't even reference that when I referenced that headline. That's another part of it that I think was quite skewed, is that these folks aren't cutting themselves checks at public companies. Public companies, the major exchanges require there to be a committee of the board who's responsible for all executive compensation decisions. And there are very clear things that must be run through that committee. And at almost all companies, that committee is required to be comprised of independent directors. At essentially every company, and there are of course outliers, but the process is we'll create a benchmark frame of reference, which is most commonly a peer group of similarly sized companies in comparable industries or businesses. And we'll look at both data from the specific group of peers on how they're compensating their executives, typically supplemented by broader survey data as well on compensation. And a company will generally have a philosophy on how they want to pay. So we want to be at the median of our competitive market, or we want to pay cash at the 25th percentile and equity at the 75th percentile. And so once we get market data, these committees of the boards will review the market data and assess where there might be a change indicated, or either in quantum or in design. And over a course of multiple meetings, we'll have thoughtful conversations on any changes to be made, what the financial implications would be, what the disclosure implications would be, what internal communications and messaging would be, and make decisions taking all of those factors into account.
Yeah, so it's quite a bit of work. It's done by the independent directors, and CEOs are not setting their own pay, I think is what I heard you say.
That is correct.
We're talking about executive compensation trends. We're going to take a short break and be right back.
What does the future of work mean for your employees? How will your company navigate ESG? Will there be a global recession? At the Conference Board, our experts translate the latest research and economic analysis into insights and real-time problem solving for your organization. Membership at the Conference Board provides your team with an assortment of knowledge, from economics, marketing and communications, ESG, public policy, and human capital. As a member, you'll have access to our center experts, member-exclusive events, data and benchmarking tools, and peer sharing that will help you understand the present and shape the future. Consider becoming a Conference Board member today by visiting www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland from the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Dana Etra, the Managing Director and Head of the Boston office for F.W. Cook, a prominent executive compensation consulting firm. Okay, so Dana, before the break, we were talking about the independent directors setting the pay of the CEO and the CEO's direct reports, the senior officers of a company. So that's all done pretty much independently with your advice and all the metrics that are involved. One of the things that has been talked about recently is what metrics are the right metrics to be used. And, in the past, a lot of it's been around stock price because that constituency were the owners and they wanted the stock price to go up. But more recently, there are more constituents, including, the customers, employees, owners, of course, and communities. So, there have been more metrics involved, including ESG metrics. Talk about those trends.
So we have seen a material and measurable increase in non-financial measures over recent years. In 2019, the 250 largest companies that we ran a study on at FW Cook, 70% had non-financial components in their annual incentive plans. And that was up to 79% in 2024. And that's just in the past 5 years. There are a few different kinds of these non-financial measures that we see. We see, what we'll call team-wide strategic measures, as well as individual performance. And within the team-wide strategic measures, there's been a lot of discussion lately around measures related to environmental, social, and governance, or ESG. We saw a tremendous uptick in that kind of measure over the past 5 years. And it's one that's come under scrutiny recently, as there have been various legal actions taken related to the use of certain ESG measures.
Now, another component of how CEOs and executives are rewarded is through perks. In the past, there's been a lot of different kinds of perks. That's mostly gone away now, but there are still a few being used. Talk about that.
The ones that we see most often that do not tend to get heavily scrutinized by shareholders are fairly benign and tend to have a small dollar value, something like financial planning and tax planning perquisites, or executive physicals. I think folks tend to understand the immediate benefit to the company and the shareholders of that type of arrangement, and those tend to be relatively small dollars. There was a lot of discussion over the past year. Some of the perquisites that are less in favor, like CEO personal use of company aircraft. And there was a Wall Street Journal article that really started that conversation with the headline, the $65 million perk for CEOs, which of course that 65 million is a sum of all of the S&P 500 CEOs personal aircraft use value. But this is one that again, I think context is critical. So the article shared that executives' personal use of corporate aircrafts was up 50% from pre-COVID levels. Now, I don't think it takes a ton of imagination to imagine why it might be in the shareholders' best interests that executives are in the corporate aircraft rather than flying commercial when there's a deadly disease out there, right? So some of this feels a little more obvious. That said, there are certain companies that were flagged for high usage, and there was a subsequent article in the Wall Street Journal focused on the gap between the proxy reported costs for personal aircraft use and the actual cost that they estimated. So it's, to me, this further points to how critical it is that the governance process be sound, that when boards are discussing this type of arrangement, we have a rationale for it. There's a reason that it's in the company's and the shareholders' best interest, that we are make sure that we're compliant from a regulatory perspective, and that we're buttoned up in how we're calculating values, how we're disclosing the process, and how we're describing the benefit, and that it's something that's regularly reviewed both in the context of the company's business situation as well as the competitive market.
Yeah, and so I think your point is really an interesting one. You know, it's 65 million across 500 companies. So these, you know, when you look at it by company, it's really not a lot of money. And you know, boards were, you know, increased it during COVID because a lot of aircraft travel, commercial aircraft travel was taken away out of the system because they stopped flying. But B, it was to protect the CEO. The health insurance thing is similar, which is or the health the physicals, because there was a case of several CEOs who died in office of these, you know, hidden things. So, you know, board said, hey, we have to protect our company because when this happens, it throws the company into chaos and so forth. So there are legitimate reasons for this. Not that everybody does everything completely legitimately. There are mistakes. There are things that happen, particularly in smaller companies, that you scratch your head over. But you know, there is. I think what I heard you say is that there's rationale for a lot of what they do.
There is, and that's I think that's tied directly into the perquisites that have fallen out of favor and not come back are the ones that there's a little less. You know, nobody has much tolerance these days for the company paying for country club dues for the CEO, for example.
Yeah, and so those have been taken away. Cars have been taken away. You know, all that kind of stuff. So it's really the aircraft use, and then how do you impute the value of it, and you know that's governed by regulation and law. So, but you know that's really the only rub that I think that's out there. Now then there's the whole disclosure of executive compensation, including these pay ratios. Talk about, you know, how that's changed and, you know, the pros and cons of that.
So the pay ratio discussion is an interesting one. And the background there is, as part of the Dodd-Frank legislation, public companies were required to disclose the ratio of CEO pay to the median employee pay. There is a lot of flexibility left to companies to figure out who the median employee is. Once that median employee is identified, it's very clearly regulated how you have to calculate their compensation. But in determining the median employee, you can figure out by any method of identifying that person what the resulting ratio would be and what are the implications. Now, there's when it first came out, the new piece of information really was what is the median employee being paid? That had not previously been publicly disclosed. But there's a lot of noise in the system. So take, for example, two large internet service providers. One of them owns the infrastructure. So they pay the guys running up the poles and fixing the wires. And the other one leases the infrastructure from some other firm. The otherwise identical, in my hypothetical here, internet service providing organizations, one of them has in-house a fleet of workers that are on the relatively lower paid side of the spectrum, and their pay ratios might disclose very differently. Now, does this mean that for a comparable job at the two organizations, one of them is a lower payer? No, it does not. Does it mean that one of them is setting CEO pay at a level that is inappropriate relative to the rest of the employee population? It does not necessarily. And so it provides useful tidbits of information, this CEO pay ratio, but there's a little too much noise in the calculation for it to be meaningful. So for example, you can't annualize seasonal workers. So retailers get absolutely killed on this, because if they have to hire someone for 3 weeks in December, they have those 3 weeks of pay to that retail associate factoring into their employees and selecting the median. So it's one of those things that, you know, was interesting to see and can shed some light on business model, but it's hard to derive any meaningful takeaway from that particular.
Yeah, and this goes back to your point, though, that there are independent directors who are working with a compensation consultant against a set of peer companies. Everything is checked so that nothing is out of whack and so forth. So, you know, in most cases, and now it's subject to shareholder vote. So, you know, if they don't like it, they can vote against it, and you know, the compensation committee needs to act. That rarely happens. So, you know, it sounds like we're in a pretty good place today versus where we were 20, 30 years ago. And yet, unfortunately, what you hear in the common press or see on TV sometimes is talking about more of what the situation was 30, 40 years ago than what the actual situation is today.
You just brought up a really, really important point, Steve, that somehow we made it this far in the conversation without referencing say on pay. So that vote you described was also part of Dodd-Frank. We call it say on pay. And it gives public company shareholders a voice on executive compensation. Now, this is a non-binding advisory vote, so it does not mandate action from these independent committees, but it brought the pay conversation front and center. And the proxy disclosure that you described, the SEC required filing that details compensation, turned from, you know, 20 years ago, it was legalese, you know, black text on white background and dense and not very interesting to read, to a marketing piece. And if you open a proxy now for an S&P 500 company, you're going to see colors, you're going to see graphics. It's an opportunity to tell your pay for performance story to your shareholders, so that your shareholders understand why you designed the programs the way you did. What were the measures used? What was your performance against those measures? And what were the pay impacts of those performance results? So say on pay and giving the shareholders a vote on this. Again, it's an advisory vote, but as you mentioned, it's not common to fail this vote. You know, less than 2% of companies do in a given year. And it brings reputational risk to the company. It brings reputational risk to the directors that sit on the compensation committee. And so it has very much framed the conversation around pay decisions in light of the fact that there'll be a percent of your shareholders that support these decisions or don't support these decisions. And we're going to need to defend whatever decisions are made.
Yeah, this is really good advice. Any final thoughts for us today, Dana?
Let's see. Let's say, you know, governance is more important than ever, but to make sure to really understand what it is we're reading about. And like with any topic, come into a conversation informed, because there is a lot that goes behind this. And I think it's a fascinating topic that can really impact business results. So.
Yeah. And don't always believe what you read about it in the press. And things are moving in the right direction. I think that's, if I heard anything, that's what I heard you say. Dana Etra, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Steve.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm Steve Odland, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.